Good morning. I'm Catherine Baird, CEO of Ethics Game, and I'm really sorry that I'm meeting with you this way by Zoom as opposed to in person. As you probably heard, my flights got all sort of cattywampus, and I couldn't quite get to Lansing in time to have this presentation with you. So I'm hoping that during our few minutes together, we'll be able to talk a little bit about what I care about deeply, which is ethics and a really interesting emerging area, AI. The whole conversation around AI is intriguing because we don't have lots of ethical guidelines yet about how we're going to manage or what we're going to do. And as we talk about ethics, AI, artificial intelligence, it brings into play our own free will and how we as people engage with AI choose to use it. As we begin to think about ethics, we are clear that ethics is translating our values into action. We know what we agree upon together and how we live together based on what it is that we see and understand in each other's lives. All we know is our behaviors. We do not necessarily know our intentions. We don't know what's in our heart. We just know our actions. Our actions are, in fact, informed deeply by our values, ideals that give significance to our lives. We choose to do things that bring us meaning and purpose and are important. Those meanings and purposes are reflected through the priorities that we choose, and we act on them consistently and repeatedly. And that's how people know what our ethical commitments are and what our values are. As we think about AI, it has amazing usages that we cannot even begin to imagine. I was just in a conversation with people who were talking about using AI to go through dozens and dozens of documents about policies that are conflicting and sorting them out to figure out what really the policies are or not, or using AI to map the methane on the earth and to be able to quickly bring up images to see what we're doing with global warming or what we're doing with other kinds of things. And of course, those of us in academics and are familiar with ChatGPT and other forms of AI that are creative writing, that are writing supports for what we do. And so as we begin to work with this marvelous new technology, the question becomes, what are we going to do with it? What's true is that each of us has a worldview, something that we believe is true about how we are going to be in our world together. About 200 years ago, the worldview was predominantly that all truth is divinely revealed. We knew from our understanding of God, whatever that might have been, from the kings, from the authorities, that we could find out what truth really was. At the beginning of the Age of Reason, we discovered or decided that all truth could be discovered through reason and science. And so as we thought about ethics, what is the right thing to do in a given situation, we thought that reason could get us there. It turns out that as we worked with the core assumption, through reason and experience, we could discover universal principles by which all people could live, that we could not get there in terms of our understanding of how we should be in community together. About 100 years ago, 125 years ago, two disruptions changed our understanding of ethics. The first is evolution. All systems gradually change. And so as we're watching technology change from when I was in college, having a self-correcting typewriter, through computers that can manipulate data, to now computers that can, using huge amounts of energy, source information and come up with new and novel ways of putting it together, we have changing systems that require new approaches to how we are in life together. The other one that was just as important is that what is real is not discoverable. It turns out that what we pay attention to is what we see and what we respond to. And there are huge swaths of things that you and I don't pay attention to. We don't have enough energy. We don't have enough bandwidth. I don't pay much attention to how my body works, and it just sort of does its own thing. But even more so, I don't necessarily pay attention to all of the different kinds of ways AI is operating in the world. I don't have enough time and energy to be able to think about them all and to follow them all. And so we have to rely on each other in order to figure out how in a new and emergent technology we are going to behave. As we think about ethics, the values that get translated into behaviors, the question is, where do they come from? You and I have three sources for what we value and how we behave. The first is our biology. About 30% of who we are as a human being is inherited. It comes from what we call our disposition. I have two children. One of them was born very pensive and thoughtful and sort of afraid of the world, and the other one was joyous and happy, engaging in the world fully. They came into the world that way. They had a particular disposition that came out of the way their genes got put together. All people, however, have a disposition towards sociability. The most important characteristic we have in terms of our ethics is we want to be accepted, we want to be part of a community, and our greatest core fear is that we will be rejected. And this core fear is actually what drives both ethical and unethical action. Our communities that are very important, our families, the families that raised us, the part of the world we were raised in, each of those communities has understandings about how one is a good person in that community. My mother used to say, if you're going to be part of the Baird family, Catherine, we expect you to do thus and so. You have to make your bed and you have to eat all your dinner, and a whole array of other ways that we are supposed to be in community together. These are all different. They all care about things like how do we survive? How do we take care of children? How do we earn a living? But they're done in very different ways. What are gender roles? What are the social roles within the community? Then you and I interact with our biology and our sociology out of our own unique being as a human being. And out of that, we make decisions about how we're supposed to be. Are we supposed to be aggressive and fully present? Are we supposed to be more cautious? Are we supposed to speak our mind fearlessly? Is that going to be okay? Or do we need to be more careful in what we say? As each of these three things come together, you and I have a unique ethical, moral imprint, a unique way of being in the world. So that leads to the question that I asked when I was your age, which was, how do I know what I'm supposed to do? How do I know what set of behaviors are going to be considered ethical as I change communities, as I move into new situations? I came of age during the civil rights movement and the second feminist wave. And so the rules were completely upended about what we were supposed to do. I went to college in the middle of the Vietnam War, where we had great conversations about whether we should be at war and what that should look like, and whether there should be a draft and who should be included in that draft. All of these social questions were up for grabs, and there was no certainty as what we were supposed to do. It turns out that ethics and morals depend. It depends on the context that we're in. It depends on the role that we have. It depends on our own value system. It depends on the value system of the organization that we're with. And so what we learn in ethics is how to navigate, how to be comfortable with the it depends part of life. Well, this slide represents my first 7 years as an academic, a lawyer teaching ethics at Regis University in Denver. The question I asked as I looked at the different ethical theories, there's between 4 and 10 of them, depending on how you count them, is there a conversation that all of these ethical theories have in common? And it turns out that every human being on the planet, every community on the planet engages two overarching questions. The first is, what is the relationship of the individual to the group? When does the individual get to say, this is how I want to live, this is what's important to me, these are the principles I'm going to live into? And when does the community get to say, this is how we expect you to live, this is what we expect you to do, this is how we expect you to behave? We have all just come through COVID, now 3 years, 4 years behind us, and yet we all remember the conversations about, do we mask or do we not mask? Do you vaccinate? How do you decide how you're going to navigate? That was a classic example of a conversation about individuals and community in great flux. The other one is head heart. What do we know for certain? What does science tell us? What does our reason tell us? And then what is our experience? As we work through our worlds, we each have different experiences of how we're supposed to be in the world. I happen to be married to a military veteran, retired after 22 years, who also happens to be a judge. And that experience of being part of the military community, being part of the legal community, has deeply informed my understanding of how the government, for example, should treat veterans, what it is that's fair or not fair in a trial. And that's added to my own experience as a faculty member, as a teacher, as an ethicist, as I explore what have been my experiences as trying to figure out what's right and wrong. And so as we move into these different ethical perspectives, these values inform which one we have preference for. You've all completed the ethical lens inventory, and you know that in that inventory, there are 4 different lenses. The one down in this corner is the one with the microscope is called the results lens. Individuals following their heart determine the goals they're going to pursue. What kind of person do they want to become? It's a very personal focus. And people in this particular lens highly value the right of individuals to choose how they want to live. Our telescope is individuals using their reason determine the universal principles that they're going to live by. These are high ideals that define who they are and what they want to be. The binoculars move us to a community side. Members of the community together determine what is going to count for fairness in this community. Who's going to be able to claim that they are the least privileged? How do we distribute the resources that we have? How do we decide who's going to get what benefits? Conversations about healthcare, safety. Currently, one that is very engaging in our community is about immigration. Who should be in or who should not be in? What do we do with people who claim asylum versus not? Those are the kinds of conversations that happen up in the relationship lens. And then down with the camera, we have our reputation lens. Members of the community determine what counts for excellence within a particular profession, within a particular community. And these are decided together. So as you are a community of learners at Michigan State University, you've had conversations with your colleagues, with your professors, with others to determine what is it that counts for being a good ethical student, what counts for working in your internship, what counts for being good in the profession you're going into, whatever version of business you're going to move forward. And all of that happens in conversation. The insight that I had is that each of those lenses privileges different values. What I mean by that is they think different values are more important than the others. As I said, in the results lens, people down there want free will. They want people to be happy, to get good results, to choose how they want to live. Up in the responsibilities lens, virtues and values such as truthfulness and accountability and being responsible and principled are more important. Over on the relationship side, we care about fairness and process and systems. And in that lens, we care deeply about taking care of those who do not have power. And in the reputation lens, you want courage and virtuousness. So depending where you landed in the ethical lens inventory, that will give you a clue as to which of these values that are shared by all of us you are going to live into and think are more important. Even more intriguing, my research has found that as we have a shared value, such as truth-telling, we have different behaviors that count for living into that value. So for example, down in the results lens, people believe that you cannot make good choices unless you know all the information. And so you're going to share all the relevant information that you have. Sometimes people say that those in the lens, share too much, TMI. Up in the responsibilities lens, you want to be factually accurate so you can build trust. And so what you do there is you craft your answer very carefully. I have a colleague who lives in that lens, and I have to ask him 20 questions whenever I want something to get to the very precise question and the very precise answer that I'm looking for. As you begin to move then into the relationship lens, the question becomes, what is going to be factually accurate? What do I need to know to ensure fairness, to make sure that the data I have is complete? And then down in the reputation lens, we have to know our facts and our context so that we can live into ethical excellence and share all of our relevant information. So as we are trying to be a person in community, as we're trying to figure out how do I behave, what do I do, we have to realize that other people in different lenses look at the world differently than we do. Over the course of our time together, we have done learners at Michigan State, and this is a typical kind of a scatter plot, we call them, for people at Michigan State University. And you can see you're everywhere. There's a slight tilting up towards the responsibilities lens, which is what we find with business majors. As we have looked at now, the slide is not updated, 650,000 people, we see how they play out with, again, people primarily in the responsibilities lens and the reputation lens. But even so, the question becomes, how do I know what to do? And that moves us then towards the ethical self. Each of us as human beings have our core values and our commitments. Each of us have a shadow side where we can be tempted. And as we think about ethics, we need to figure out how that shadow side is going to be activated and what we need to do to be aware of it and not use it as we move ahead. So, artificial intelligence. Most of us in the academic world are concerned about how we are going to use AI in an appropriate way and how we're going to use the tools available. So here's a case that came across my desk. As I go through this, I want you to think about, who do you think is the most unethical in this situation? As you know, you guys get papers that are assigned to you. So a faculty member assigned a paper. The students then went to a company called Fiverr and they hired somebody to write a paper, $100 per paper. That way they wouldn't have to do the research. They'd have a good paper that was well put together. The faculty member who assigned the paper worked for Fiverr, and he wrote the paper for his own students. And so it was found out that they got an A on their paper, so they were happy. But he also made over $15,000 a year writing papers for the students. Now, as we look at this, we know that something is not quite right. Should the students have not gone to the paper writing company? Should the faculty not have charged for it? These are the kinds of ethical conundrums that we face. And as an individual, you might be a student, you might be the teacher. How are you going to choose to behave in a situation like this? These are what we call our ethical blind spots, places that we're not aware of what we do, but more importantly, temptations under stress. I've had many students tell me that they get too many papers, too many assignments, they don't have time to do them all. They're busy with their internships or at work or their clubs and building their resume. And so they're going to take an easy way out. It's not going to make a difference anyway. Vices emerge as we choose to act unethically. Most of us don't live into our vices. Most of us live into and succumb to the temptations. What I believe is that small acts of moral courage or cowardice shape the direction of your lives. There's a wonderful new book out called Fluke, and it talks about the myriads of tiny choices we make that inform and decide our decisions. For example, when I was planning on flying out to Lansing, at the last minute, I made a decision to pack a bag and check it instead of carry it on. Had I chosen to carry it on, I would have been able to go to a different airline and get to Michigan perhaps in time to be with you in person. A tiny decision that changed the direction of my life. And those are the decisions we make all the time with our ethical choices. How do we treat each other in our companies, in our organizations? How do we live into our values? As we think about how to become ethically mature, the first place we become is with ethical awareness. What do we believe? What do we believe about ourselves, about others, about the faculty members, about the business world we're going into, about our world at large? What patterns do you have? One of the patterns that I recognized in myself is that I often would get right on top of a deadline and then I wouldn't be able to do good work. And so I began to train myself to do things in a more appropriate fashion. I noticed that my first response to people was being angry because I didn't understand them. And I learned how to be more gracious, more compassionate, and not come on fiercely in my first interaction. Those are the patterns that you can watch in how you treat yourself and others that help you to develop moral courage so you can act from the best that you know at a time. As we think about our ethics, we have to be aware of the core human needs that we have as human beings. Each of us need to have material and social resources to take care of ourselves. The expectation in every community is that people will do their very best to meet their own needs through working, through the various other tools that are in our community. Each of us has a need to know the truth. What really is going on? Do we have a shared understanding of our life together? We have a need to be safe and protected in our community. And we have, as I said earlier, a need to belong. As we think about our ethics, we're going to behave in a way that will help us live into these needs. And as we move into positions of responsibility, we are going to want to make sure that we support each other in meeting these needs. How then do we do this? We begin by thinking about how we want to resolve the tension perhaps of how to use AI, how to program it in a way that makes some sense. We have to be attentive as we frame the ethical issue. What really is going on in this situation? We have a place of upset, which is our thwarted intentions. We have an intention that we get good information. We have a tension that we use the technology appropriately, and then that intention is not fulfilled. As we think about the results lens, we can ask some questions that will help us get past those thwarted intentions. What do I really want? What's going to make me happy? What consequences am I willing to tolerate? Am I willing to have a piece be written using artificial intelligence and then just have somebody discover that I did this and have my work not be challenged or have my work challenged? There's a story running around the legal community, and over again, I can't believe people are not doing this more than once, where Chat GPT or another AI platform is used to write a brief for a court. And one of the things we know about ChatGPT is it makes stuff up. If it doesn't exactly have the answer, it will create an answer. And attorneys were turning in papers without checking the sites, and they were turning in documents that had fake cases in them. And the question becomes, why didn't you check? And yet each of us, as we're pressed against time, may not have time to check all of the sites that come through, or not even know which sites to check. And then what are mutually good results for everybody? The next place we move to then is, what are the ethical boundaries? What are the agreed upon understandings of how we're going to be in community together, both mine personally as well as those of others? As we think about those become unfulfilled expectations. Business is built on trust. There is no number of contracts sufficient to conduct business. We cannot write contracts that are foolproof enough to guarantee that we will get along with each other. And so we have to have trust that we can work together and that people will in fact keep their word. And so as we're moving into a situation, we ask what principles are important. What are the responsibilities that I'm going to have in this particular case? What about other people? And then how do I fulfill my duties while I'm caring for others? That process helps us define the boundaries of our behaviors together as we begin to build trust. We then need to learn to work with others, to move to the community side of the conversation. In this, a core beginning part of ethical agility is celebrating difference, noticing how others contribute to variety. Having everybody think exactly the same and behave exactly the same would be incredibly boring. On top of which, we have tons of things that have to be done to make our planet work, and one person cannot do them all. However, if we're going to work with people who are different from us, we have to listen carefully. What do they know? What was their experience? What values do they hold that are important? And as we listen to them carefully, we can notice the connections. We can notice what John Rawls calls overlapping concerns, overlapping places where we can build commitment as opposed to confrontation. As we look at ethical interdependence, we realize that those four basic human needs get handled in our lives together. As an individual, I make a choice that contributes to my happiness and thriving, and I support you in making those choices as well. I also engage in the process of figuring out what for me are important principles. What for me is going to be what we call the ethics exit card. What will I not do? What will I do in my life with others? Together as a community, we design and implement processes. We have judicial processes. We have contract processes. We have administrative processes. Within an organization, you have standard operating procedures. All of those processes are negotiated among people with differences about how we are going to live together. And then we agree on character traits that represent virtuous living. A good business person does this, a good marketer does this, a good manager does this, a good financial planner does this. And we learn what those traits are and we work to live into them so that we are seen as a good member, a virtuous member of our community. Alfred North Whitehead is one of my very favorite philosophers, and he said, together we construct reality. Together we determine what is and is not real. As we think about artificial intelligence and the way that it's going to be used, all of us together are going to decide on the parameters. I was talking to Rex Humpston, who is my program person this morning, and he said one of the questions with Google was if you typed in beautiful women, what pictures would show up? Were they pictures that represented the demographics of the United States as we know them? Were there pictures that privileged one race of women over another? CEOs, who comes up? And so the Google people had to figure out what are the algorithms? What is the tension between what is, where in the CEO world it's heavily populated by white males, versus aspirational, where CEOs represent a broader mix of who we are in the United States. Those programming decisions, those algorithms, are going to determine what you and I see and what you and I believe is truth. And so those questions and those processes become very important. As we make these decisions, we change the direction of our world, but our own self-value is then connected to the value of others. Remember how I said the greatest fear that we have is that we are going to be kicked out of community. And so as we begin to look at our work and see whether others value us and see if others find us useful and part of the community, we are going to tie our value to the value of the whole. This moves us into being responsible. In any situation, we have a range of behaviors that we can choose as we are going to live and work together. And so we have to use our imagination to think about how we want to be. The third source of upset is undelivered communication. One of the greatest problems in any organization is that people sit on upset and they don't talk with each other to figure out what the differences are. As you live and work in different ethical perspectives, you find out that we have different values. I remember doing a training once with a bunch of nurses who were faculty members, and we had a bunch of them up in the responsibilities lens, another whole bunch of them down in the reputation lens. The conversation was, what is civility? The people in the responsibilities lens, civility said, is doing my work, doing it professionally, and making sure that the processes, the protocols are followed. The people down the reputation lens said, civility is making sure that the other person feels valued, feels important. And all of a sudden they realized they were using the same word with completely different behaviors and were not talking with each other about what behaviors were expected in that situation. As we begin to navigate that space, then we ask questions like, what is a fair process? Whose voice needs to be heard? How do you care for those without power? Each of us in our various spheres of concern have a measure of power. We have our personal power. We have power from what we know. We have power from our roles. All of that becomes important as we begin to think about how we are in community together. And then finally, we act with courage. We have gone through a process of framing the question, identifying the boundaries, choosing an option for action, and then actually doing it. As we make our final decision, we ask questions like, what actions would set a good example? What virtues are required by my role as I am looking at myself in the various communities that I'm part of? And then how can I be a servant leader? As each of us think about ethical maturity, I invite you to commit to a path of growth. One of the greatest temptations or questions you have as a college senior, junior senior, getting ready to graduate is, can I live in a community with ambiguity and figure out how to live into my best self? Can I live in a place where different people have different understandings of what it means to be ethical and still find my own path forward? If you cannot learn to live with that ambiguity, you have a much harder time moving into ethical maturity. You also have an opportunity to create reality thoughtfully. Each of us determines the meaning of what happens to us. I get cut off on the road and I can decide that someone's just being angry, or I can decide that somebody is missing their exit and needs to get over to the exit quickly, and I can be gracious and let them in. I can have someone who's scowling at me in the grocery store and I can decide that they are just mean, or I could decide that they are in a hurry and preoccupied with many other things. We interpret the behavior of others, and then our response depends on that interpretation. And then we can actively participate in our role. Brian Henning is a philosopher who works up at Gonzaga, and he said that one of the most important things that we need to do is to embrace fallibility. Can we be willing to change our ideas and opinions as we seek the truth? The other thing we have to learn to do is to be in that tension while we're exploring and figuring out what's going on. We have to be comfortable, try to be comfortable with that intensity of differences instead of retreating and not exploring. And then we have to improvise, grow, and evolve. As each of us are facing this amazing growth of AI, you and I are going to figure out how we're going to live into the possibilities. Now, while we're trying to figure out how to use AI, we have other kind of considerations. AI uses a tremendous amount of power, tremendous amount of water in order to keep all of the machines cool that are generating all this information. How are we going to use our water? How much AI do we need if it impacts the resources? These are questions we're just barely starting to ask. And you and I, and you in particular, are going to have to improvise, grow as you realize and work into these opportunities. This requires the final step, which is to be reflective, to notice what's going on, not just in your little world, but within your circle of concern and the world larger. As we notice that we behaved in a way that was not useful, how do we begin to think about behaving differently? As we got a response we hadn't expected, how do we begin to think about how we can moderate what we do? As we take into consideration the values and behaviors and expectations of others, how can we adjust to find those overlapping circles of concern that help us build commitment as opposed to confrontation? 4 questions are really useful in this conversation. The first is, what do you really want? What really is important to you? Sometimes I have found that being right is not necessarily useful. I can be right and offend and upset any numbers of people. Being right is not necessarily the end goal for all things. What do I believe in this situation? Is that belief accurate? Is it truthful? Is it useful? How am I using my power? This one I find is the most difficult because many people don't think they have any power. And then, am I being a good example? What we know from behavioral psychology is that the way that people behave in a setting is going to determine the way others behave. What do I mean by that? We have found that if you are in an office and you put up a little platitude that says, telling the truth is the best policy, kindness is my answer to life, that people will ask you to do fewer unethical things because they know your value commitments. And so you are not even invited to participate because they know that you're going to say no. How do you signal to others your value commitments? If you're in a conversation and someone starts gossiping and being snarky, do you join in? If you're in a situation where there is bullying going on, do you stand back passively or do you say something about the behavior? If you notice other people cheating, what do? I was talking to a faculty member who went through great lengths in his class in auditing, I believe it was, to make sure that nobody cheated on an online test. And he had in his class something that he called Sentinels of Honesty. And this is where people learned and practiced holding each other accountable to the values of the class. He got a test, and one of the students called or texted him and said that somebody in the class had been cheating. And he was like, how did that happen? I had cameras and I looked at everything. And it turned out that the students had put Post-it notes on their screen with the various answers that could not be seen, of course, by the camera. And then the faculty member said, how do you know that? You weren't there. And he'd go, well, they posted in the chat that this is how they were getting the answers and invited other people to try it. You wonder about why you would put it in a chat that you are cheating in a class where you're not supposed to cheat. But we as lawyers know that people who do unethical, illegal things often will try to out themselves to see if they're going to get approval by the community. And then that because there was an expectation of honesty, an expectation of holding each other accountable, the student was able to come forward in a semi-anonymous way and begin to make that behavior more transparent. Those of you who are accounting majors know that that notion of mutual accountability is very important in the accounting field, which is why perhaps in that auditing class that became an important value to begin to practice and to learn what it looks like to hold each other accountable. So as we begin to think about ethics, I invite you to begin to think about three things. First, one of the things that happens when we meet with each other is that we begin to think of each other as what we call instruments. Can you help me? Am I going to get something from you? Will we get a contract? Will you be my friend? Rather than just sort of being with people in situations and saying, you have value just through who you are. Can I get to know you better? Can I see where we have overlapping circles of concern? As we interact with each part of creation with its intrinsic worth and dignity, we become more gentle in the way that we walk in our world. We become more open and accepting of others and are able to find ways that we can work together in community. If we believe that we have agency, if we believe that we have choice, if we believe that our actions are not conditioned by our birth or our culture, we will stop and engage in the thought process of, how do I want to behave? What do I want to do? How do I want to be known? And this process then gives us, within what we call in philosophy, bounded agency. There's some things we cannot change. There are some ingrained patterns that we may not be aware of. But as those patterns become clear to us, as we become more familiar with who we are, as we know that we can stop and think and choose to react in a certain way and then build patterns of reactions, we become people who are agents, who are ethical agents, and we can become effective in the work we do. And then finally, we get to understand that everything we do is significant. Everything we do makes a difference. Every little tiny thing we do changes the direction of history. In the book Fluke, the author talks about the fact that his father was married prior to being married to his mother. And the father's first wife was mentally ill and killed her children, the three children, and herself. And the author said, but for my father's first wife being mentally ill, I would not exist, because he would never have had other children. He would never have married his mother. And it was a fluke that he even existed. Take a minute to think about that. Think of all of the different kind of randomnesses that happen for you to be here and you to be making a difference. So everything you do, every choice you make, every word you speak, every action changes ever so slightly what happens in the world. You make a difference. So as you think about your ethical self, your identity, who are you as an ethical person? What values are important to you? What choices are you going to make? I invite you to do it with as much awareness as you have and you can muster, with a willingness to tolerate the ambiguity of life, and yet to move forward fearlessly, confidently, that you are important, you make a difference. Thank you.